What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive into the top standard decks currently in the meta, just to give us an idea of where the meta is, maybe where it may be possibly going as we go into Phyrexia, which is right around the corner. This is probably the last video I'll probably do on this, as I'll wait till the new set comes out and see how that really affects the meta overall. With that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's start talking about it. So the first deck up on the list is Izzet Ramp. This is a deck that I feel like has kind of seen some more gain in popularity over the course of the standard season, as we are in this little bit of a lull period where there really hasn't been too much added into standard since Brothers War. But this is a deck that I actually enjoyed, and I actually think I featured here on the channel at some point, I think a couple weeks ago. And it's overall a fun Izzet Ramp style deck that we're trying to play really big artifacts for the most part. We have a lot of things that create ways to ramp our mana up overall, and trying to hit the big expensive spells like Cityscape Leveler, which is a card that just destroys target non-land permanent, and they get a Power Stone token, but it's something that we can immediately destroy something. If it gets killed, then we can unearth it and get to do the effect again, and then whenever it attacks, we get to trigger it yet again, which is definitely pretty sweet with that card. Another card that's also in the list as a decent one or the other kind of thing is Skitterbeam Battalion. It is a 9 mana 4/4, or it's a 5 mana 2/2, and it has Trample and Haste. And when you cast it, it enters the battlefield with 2 additional copies. So depending on what mana cost you get, we'll have 2 additional copies at whatever power it is. Other than that, this deck is just a very solid top to bottom. Let me just keep the board as clear as possible, have as many ways to kind of ramp ourselves up. We have things like Stern Lesson as a draw spell that creates a Power Stone token, allows us to dig a little bit deeper, and like I said, create a Power Stone token, which is good ramp. We also have Thorian Spider, a decent 3 mana 2/4 with reach, which is good to block flyers. And when it comes into the battlefield, even though you give your opponent a Power Stone token, you also get one. And then for 7 mana, we can look at the top 4 cards of our library and can reveal an artifact card among them and put that card into our hand, the rest of the bottom of our library in any random order. And it just has various ways of keeping the board clear with some counter spells, as well as a little bit of spot removal and a Brotherhood's End, especially against the more aggressive aggro decks. And then Reckoner Bankbuster is just a very solid card in most decks that are a little bit on the slower side, just because itself helps us dig a little bit deeper. And then on the upside here is that it actually gets to get crewed and attack as a 4/4. This is definitely a solid list. It's definitely a list that I think will gain some more popularity as we go into Phyrexia, which seems to be setting up for a little bit more of a combination of artifacts and also Phyrexian creatures. So definitely a deck that could see some more improvement as we get the new cards. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Rakdos Midrange. This is a deck that I feel like is kind of just below some of the other decks that are kind of more at the top of the list, as it is only a 2-color deck. We kind of limit ourselves on what we can do with those 2 colors, but we still play some of the best cards that are currently exist in the meta. Things like Fable of the Mirror Breaker being probably the best card. Also, Invoke Despair is a very punishing kind of big spell that we can just kind of make our opponents start sacrificing things, or they lose a bunch of life and we get some card draw out of that. And then we have things like Shieldred, as well as just being that card that penalizes our opponent for drawing additional cards, and whenever we draw a card, we gain some life. So it works very well with a lot of what the deck is trying to do. And I do think the other thing that makes this deck very, very good is because it is black mana. In one sense, it has some of the best removal in the game, with things like Go for the Throat and also Cut Down, both being very aggressive, very good removal spells in the meta overall. Outside of that, has some of the typical cards you would see in more of a grindy mid-range style deck, like Reckoner Bankbuster, another appearance here, Graveyard Trespasser. Gix is kind of an interesting card, just a one-off, just to kind of get maybe some additional card draw, as well as Liliana, just another way to kind of maybe make things, grind out your opponent by discarding cards in their hand or making them sacrifice creatures. And I guess if you can really get them to the -6, you can then start separating their cards into separate piles and making them sacrifice certain things. But overall, this deck is very solid from top to bottom, and definitely a deck that is something to kind of think about when it comes to playing in the meta. The next deck up on the list is going to be Mardu Angels. Now, this is another interesting deck that, as you see, there is a theme to this. It's playing, a lot of these decks are playing one particular color, that color being red, as, Fable of the Mirror Breaker seems to be probably the best card currently in the meta. Like I said previously, it's probably a really, really strong card, but we are splashed into the Angels archetype. We have some decently beefy angels that definitely help us overall. Things like Sanctuary Warden as kind of like that top end angel in the deck, comes in the battlefield with shield counters. We can remove shield counters, create a 1/1 citizen, also get to draw a card out of it. We have Liza. Whenever something we control is other than Liza that's a non-token, we get to return to our hand at the beginning of the next end step, which is definitely very good. And anything our opponent would control would die. It actually gets exiled, which is decent. Sarah Paragon allows us to replay things that have converted mana cost 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield, meaning that we can essentially cast the bottom half, the beginning of our deck essentially over again, which is definitely pretty sweet. Archangel Wrath as kind of like a 4-mana 3/4 flying lifelinker that we can kick up to 2 times if we have the mana available and deal 2 damage to any target, and we gain 2 life in the process. And it's definitely a very solid deck. It's one of those things that if it gets going and your opponent doesn't really do anything about it, it definitely can take the game over pretty quickly. And it's definitely a very solid deck that can grind games out just like the other decks here on the list. But definitely a cool archetype to see some popularity and some rise overall in the meta. The next deck coming in on this list is going to be Mono Blue Tempo. Now, this is a deck list that's kind of been around. It's definitely one of those deck lists that has not really changed too much. This is just a deck full of counter spells, bounce spells, any sort of way to get some sort of tempo to kind of keep you rolling when it comes to those types of things. It's probably the cheapest deck list on this list of all these decks in the meta, just because it only requires you really to have 4 rares. And I guess if you want to spend extra rares, you can actually add in things like March Swirl and Miss. You can add things like Otawara. And I do think it's just more a personal preference if you want to add those cards or not. But all that this deck is really trying to do is disrupt what your opponent's doing, make the game very frustrating for them to really resolve anything. And then eventually, once the graveyard fills up, you can cast things like Haughty Djinn, and then Haughty Djinn comes out and it's maybe like a 7/4 or something like that, and then you can cast like a 1-mana Tolarian Terra. It's just one of those decks that's just trying to push disruption and then kind of resolve one big spell and then protect from there and hopefully finish the game off shortly. Like I said, it's one part reason this deck is good in the sense that it does a lot that is good, and the other reason why it's probably pretty popular is for the fact that it is a deck that's relatively on the not expensive side, which makes it very approachable for players with limited budget in both physical and digital. But with that being said, let's move on to the next deck. The next deck up on the list is going to be Azorius Soldiers. Now, this is definitely one of those aggro decks that are definitely very fun to play. A lot of the cards in it kind of help each other in one way or the other, as we don't play any non-creature spells, so a lot of the value comes from the creature itself and how it helps us, get what we need to do to beat our opponent. It's a deck that is on the small side, where a lot of creatures are on the cheap side, so we can get very wide very quickly. And we have a lot of ways to kind of help put pressure on our opponent's life total with not just having additional creatures on the battlefield, but we have ways to dig a little bit deeper with things like Skystrike Officer, allow us to tap down tap 3 untap soldiers we control. We get to draw a card. Whenever it attacks, it also creates a soldier, which is definitely very good. You have things like Meryl, which allows us to basically prevent our opponent from really doing anything on our turn, which is definitely pretty solid. And then whenever she attacks, she also creates soldier tokens based on how many other soldiers we control. You have our Lord with Valiant Better in here, with giving our soldiers +1/+1, and then being able to be exiled from a graveyard, giving all our soldiers additional +1/+1 counter, which is definitely pretty sweet. And then you have things like Thalia, that if you're on the play and you play this against an opponent, it actually delays maybe their plan because it makes all their non-creature spells cost 1 more. And like I said, we don't play a single non-creature spell in the list, which definitely makes it very, very, good for us because it's not hurting us in any sort of way. And this is definitely a deck that is very good fun from top to bottom. If you're looking for a deck that is around a certain theme, this is probably that list. And it's definitely a good deck to check out if you're looking to play, a lot of cards that are on the newer side rather than cards that have been around probably for the past couple months. As a lot of the cards that help make this deck work were all from Brothers War, which is definitely pretty sweet as well. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Esper Midrange, and this is definitely a very interesting deck out of a lot of the mid-range decks because it is probably more on the control side, as it has a lot more ways to disrupt what your opponent's casting. Outside of things like Make Disappear, we also play Obscura Interceptor as another way to kind of make their opponent cast a spell. We get to play this at flash speed, and then we bounce that spell back to their hand, meaning they have to recast it, and we connive, which means we get to draw a card and discard a card, and it has lifelink, which is definitely pretty sweet. It's definitely a deck that, plays a lot of good spells in general. It doesn't play probably the best spell in the meta, but it still plays some really, really strong spells in the meta in general, with things like being Shieldred. We have Wandering Emperor. You have Rafine here. You have Kaido. You have Graveyard Trespasser, Wedding Announcement, all really, really strong cards in the meta. Definitely can get the job done. It's definitely a lot of the spells have extra value outside the cards themselves. And it's definitely a fun deck to play if you're looking for maybe that more mid-rangey control style deck. This is definitely one of those decks that you could check out, and it makes sense as to why this deck is here on the overall popularity when it comes to the meta overall. The next deck up on the list is going to be Mono White Midrange, and this is definitely a deck that's kind of gained popularity over the course of probably the past month or so, and it's definitely an interesting take on Mono White, just because typically what most people are used to if you've been playing Standard for a while is Mono White being more of the aggro aggressive decks of the format, but this is kind of taking a little bit differently approach and going more of the mid-range effect and trying to disrupt what our opponent's doing in the early game to kind of get to that mid-range and where a lot of the good spells for mono white are. We have things like Sanctuary Warden being like the big top end card in the deck, as it is a 5/5 flyer. And it's a battlefield with 2 shield counters on it, and then whenever it attacks, you can remove a shield counter from a creature or planeswalker control. If we do, we get to draw a card and get a 1/1 soldier citizen token. Which is definitely pretty sweet. You have Steel Seraph, which could be an early game creature or a late game creature, and itself, at the beginning of combat, we can give target creature control flying, vigilance, or lifelink at the end of turn. And then you have things like Sarah Paragon, which allows us to replay things in the early game. You have Wandering Emperor, probably the best mono white planeswalker, just because it has a way to just exile things, gain a little bit of life. It can create tokens if we need it, or it gives target creature a counter, which is definitely very good, which works very well with the Sanctuary Warden. So we can +1, maybe put a +1/+1 counter on Sanctuary Warden or another creature, and then if we need to, we can always remove that +1/+1 counter. And it plays some of the best kind of spot removal spells that mono white has to offer, with things like Lay Down Arms. We have Temporary Lockdown, which is very good against other aggro matchups, and they have things like One Announcement, which is just kind of one of those cards that if it resolves and we get to slowly tick tokens on the battlefield and get it to that third chapter, we then get all our creatures that much bigger. And then a lot of what the early game is trying to do outside of that is as things like Farmhand, making sure we hit land drops. You have Commando, which hits things like artifacts and enchantments, which is definitely very good. And it's just definitely a very solid deck list from top to bottom in that way. It's very good. It's definitely one of those decks that could get better with like Phyrexia. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how some of the more expensive, more mid-rangey mono white cards work in this deck. But nonetheless, it's still a very, very solid deck from top to bottom. The next deck up on the list is going to be Mono Black, and this one's more of a mid-range version, but Mono Black can also be an aggro deck, and this deck could be aggro as well because it has some of the more powerful creatures in the Mono Black color. It's a deck that has a lot of good value. The cards themselves have good value. Here we get a little bit more Planeswalkers with Liliana and Sorin, both very solid value Planeswalkers. You have things like Invoke Despair being the top end spell of the deck, helping us get extra value. Combine that with Shieldred, another card that gives value in the sense that it puts pressure on your opponent's life total. Graveyard Trespasser, eating things, putting pressure on your opponent's life total. Tenacious Underdog being a solid 2-drop that just puts pressure early on because it's a 3/2 for 2. Evolve Sleeper allows us to sink mana into it to make it stronger, make it a problem card. And then as the game goes on, it could be a card that helps us draw cards at the cost of 1 life. And it has some of the best spot removal spells. And there's a reason why this deck is probably as good as it is. It has some of the best value cards in the black color in standard, which makes it definitely very playable. It could get better with Phyrexia coming out around the corner, as there's some pretty interesting mono black cards that could find their way maybe as a copy or two in here. But this list is definitely very fine-tuned and definitely very, very good. And it's a list that plays very, very well as you play it on curve. So definitely a good deck to look out for when it comes to playing in the standard meta. The next deck up on the list is going to be Mono Red Aggro, and this is definitely probably the best aggro deck in the format. It's very good at what it's trying to do. It hits your opponent's life total very, very quickly. Has a lot of burn spells that definitely deal damage to our opponent's face, which is definitely very good. Putting additional pressure on our opponent's life totals very, very quickly as well. And it has a lot of creatures that just have haste, meaning they can attack immediately when they come into the battlefield, which makes this deck very good. It curves out very well in most hands, as it's a deck that doesn't need a ton of lands really to do what it needs to do. Really, probably hitting 3 to 4 lands is probably a nice sweet spot. 5 lands is probably like the best spot because it gets additional benefits of some of the cards. But still, nonetheless, is definitely a very solid list. It's definitely very aggressive. Punishes decks that play too slow or aren't playing fast enough to put enough pressure to stop what we're trying to do. And that's definitely makes this deck definitely stand out compared to the other aggro decks of the format. But with that being said, let's move on to the next and final deck. And the final deck list we have here is Grixis Midrange. This is probably the best deck currently in standard, has the biggest meta share overall, almost double of what Mono Red Aggro does have currently in the meta in both best of 1 and best of 3. It means that probably the deck has has very strong performances, meaning that a lot of people want to play it because they also want to have those strong performances. It probably has access to some of the best cards currently in standard as well. Fable the Mirror Breaker being one of them, Shieldred's another one, Invoke Despair. You have access to some of the best Planeswalkers in Sorin and Liliana, and then you have access to also the best removal spells in both Cut Down, Go for the Throat, Abrade as another one, and then Make Disappear. And creature-wise, this deck is still very good as well, with Bloodtithe Harvester and Corpse Appraiser both being very solid creature choices for this archetype. And then Blade Coil Serpent being that kind of like big creature at the end of the game that you can sink mana into depending on what your mana is. And you get certain effects depending on what colors you pay. You can either draw cards, you can make your opponent discard cards, or you give a +1/+0 and gain trample and haste at the end of turn, meaning that this card itself can also finish off your opponent if you want to invest a lot of mana into it. And this deck is just very solid, and it does put up good results. And like I said, said, the only thing that may change is maybe some variations of how many of certain cards you want to play. But still, nonetheless, this deck is very good from top to bottom. With that being said, each of these decks are definitely very solid options in the meta currently if you're looking for a new deck to play, with Phyrexia right around the corner. These are also good decks to get an idea of what people are playing in the meta if that's something you're into as well. I'll have a link down in the description below to mtgdecks.net. This is kind of where I pulled the information. I just pulled it for all of Standard, so these lists combine best of 1, best of 3, paper, digital, so it's just a good culmination of just where Standard is in general for the meta. So if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to know post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I'll see you in the next video.